in a strange light, the glowing fires mixing with the beams from the decorative street lamps into an orange glow. The troops were rumbling up the avenue on packed lorries, their helmets glinting in the light, shooting as they came. As the first truck passed her, she saw that under their helmets the soldiers' faces were young, and many of them looked scared. Pedal carts were speeding up the street ahead of them, with bloody people lying crumpled across their wooden trays. And yet the crowd stayed, lining the avenue. As they stood there, like an audience in a ghastly parody of a patriotic parade, someone began to sing. It was the International. The words rang out. "Arise, ye prisoners of starvation. Arise, ye wretched of the earth." All around her people began to sing, and she sang too. They sang it as loudly as they could, this anthem of the oppressed, as the soldiers rode past. They sang not far from where Wei Jingsheng had once upon a time posted his plea for democracy on an ordinary wall. They sang where they had demonstrated in the weeks before, buoyed with excitement. They sang even as the trucks were followed by armored personnel carriers, and then by tanks, as the air filled with the guttural sound of an army turning their city into a battleground. Up ahead was a square where they would never go again with pleasure, a place that in the weeks before had truly felt like a public ground, a place where the last demonstrators were now waiting by the monument to the people's heroes for the final confrontation. And as she sang, her eyes fixed on a single child's shoe lying discarded on the ground, soaked with blood. By 1:30 a.m., the army was surrounding Tiananmen Square. Units had pushed up through Beijing from the north, south, east, and west, joining those already sequestered within the buildings lining the square. Each unit had encountered resistance. Each had answered with deadly force. Now they sat and waited for the next move. For a couple of hours, wounded demonstrators had been arriving at the square, yet thousands of demonstrators still clustered around the monument to the people's heroes. They still clung to their role as heroes, all the more reluctant to leave now that all across the city people were dying in their cause. As in the weeks before, a debate broke out between those urging retreat and those who wanted to stay. Hou Zhijian exhorted the students to leave. Enough blood had been spilled that night to awaken the people, he said, and the students had already shown that they were not afraid to die. They need not do more. But the student leader, Chailing, refused to direct the students either to stay or to go. This, she declared, should be their choice to make. Finally, Hou Zhijian and Liu Xiaobo decided to try and negotiate safe passage for the students. It was almost 4 a.m. when the two men drove in an ambulance up to the army lines and presented their offer to an officer. If the army would agree not to shoot, they would organize the students to leave the square. The offer was accepted, but they were told to hurry. Deng's dawn deadline was dictating the course of events. The students then held one final vote. The question to leave was to be decided on the voices. When the vote was called, the shouts to stay sounded just as loud as the votes to go. The student leader who called the vote declared it a vote to go. Later he explained why. Those wanting to go would be embarrassed to yell too loudly, he reasoned, while those wanting to stay would be all the louder in their bravado. So if both sounded the same, it must be a majority to go. And so they began to leave. The army was already moving in on the students by this time, pushing towards them slowly with their guns at the ready. There was no time left to debate. The student leaders performed one last service, insisting the students drop any weapons they might have and leave in orderly lines. The students retreated under the banners of their colleges, singing "The International" and holding hands. Behind them, the goddess of democracy toppled to the ground. The tanks took up their position on the square. The army had delivered it to the government once more. It seems Deng Xiaoping got his wish that morning, and no one was killed within the square itself. It was a distinction that the government would make much of in the days, months, and years that followed. But even China's official figures recorded hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries outside the square as the army prosecuted its mission. Figures initially released by the Chinese Red Cross, but then retracted, suggested thousands had died, as did a melancholy news report by Radio Beijing broadcast on the afternoon of June 4th. In the immediate aftermath, BBC journalist Kate Adie, who produced some of the most compelling reports on the massacre, reported a figure of 1,000 killed based on sources within Beijing's hospitals. The most exhaustive attempt to count the dead was undertaken by Canadian historian Timothy Brooke, who visited Beijing in the months after June 4th. Based on contemporaneous reports of casualties counted at a number of Beijing hospitals, he arrived at a figure very near the initial Chinese Red Cross figure of 2,600 dead. The true figure may never be known, but the sheer diversity of those who died speaks to the indiscriminate nature of the Army's actions and refutes the government's claims that the majority of those who died were counter-revolutionary riots. Children died as well as pensioners in their homes. Pedicab drivers were shot while trying to deliver the injured to hospitals, as were ambulance drivers. Deaths reached into the highest government circles, too. The chauffeur of one of the elders was killed, as was the son-in-law of a senior official of the National People's Congress. He was a man at Mushidi shot while fetching water by a lighted kitchen window. The actions of some of the bereaved also speak to the immensity of the tragedy. A father carried the body of his 4-year-old son around with him for days after June 4th, showing his wounds to anyone who would look. University students paraded the bodies of their slain classmates around the campuses of Tsinghua, Peking University, the People's University, and the Beijing Language University. At the Chinese University of Political Science and Law, students laid out the body of one of their classmates on a table and surrounded him with ice, keening for him. The violence did not stop once the square was cleared. Many more people were killed in the hours that followed. An official report to the leadership told of one particularly cold-blooded attack on a group of students making their way home to the university on foot, having earlier evacuated the square. A tank charged into their group, killing 11 instantly. Despite the danger, as terrible as the day of June 4th wore on, Beijingers continued assembling near the square to pay witness to what had occurred and to protest. All through that day, Western journalists watched horrified from their vantage points in the Beijing Hotel, just east of the square, as soldiers fired point-blank into small crowds of people who gathered to curse the soldiers. Dozens died in broad daylight on the Avenue of Eternal Peace. The number of military casualties during the crackdown is also uncertain. There is no doubt that soldiers died in the action, some brutally murdered by the crowd. The official toll announced in the days immediately following June 4th counted 23 soldiers dead and 200 missing. Later research by a Chinese historian, Wu Renhua, identified 14 military deaths, of whom 8 had been killed in direct fighting with demonstrators. In the absence of a full public accounting for the bloodshed, the details of these soldiers' stories too are missing from history. Like millions of people around the world, I watched the events unfold on television. I had left China the summer before on a high. The chill that had fallen on the city after the removal of Huyaoban had been replaced by an almost feverish atmosphere of excitement. At the start of the year, I had witnessed with some amazement the first open press conference ever held during the National People's Congress, although the rest of the proceedings had taken place behind closed doors. People close to the government seemed to welcome the chance to discuss China's situation openly. River Elegy had been broadcast in the weeks before I left, and it seemed no one could decide which was more extraordinary, the argument it contained or the fact that it had been broadcast at all. My own belief was that it was inevitable that China would ultimately embrace some kind of democracy. Yes, there would be reversals, as there had been in 1979, 1983, and in 1987, but in the end, these would only be brief setbacks. When students and ordinary Beijingers began to fill the square in the spring of 1989, I felt that energy and passion I had experienced in Beijing's underground was finally breaking cover. This is what I had seen behind closed doors, I thought, a sense that the entire society had to change, a longing for a role to play in what could be a great venture. And there was also just a longing for color, excitement, romance. I'd seen people singing Cui Jian in their homes, and now they were singing him in Tiananmen Square. As the weeks passed, I watched events unfold, gripped by every twist. When the People's Daily editorial was issued, I felt a chill of fear that was instantly replaced by excitement at the bravado of the students and, more importantly, the ordinary people of Beijing. I watched almost with disbelief when Chinese journalists, who I knew as cowed and depressed by their designated role in state propaganda, suddenly took to the streets to demonstrate and later began to actually report what was going on. Even as the weeks wore on and the stalemate became more evident, I was still excited, still hopeful that it would all end well. Martial law was a shock, but when Beijingers flooded into the streets to reason with the soldiers, and they in turn consented to be stopped, I began to believe that the government must surely recognize that only a political solution could work. Even on the evening of June 3rd, as I watched the news pictures of the soldiers yet again being prevented from entering the capital, I believed it would be okay. Surely the People's Army would never turn on the people. I believed the long-standing propaganda as much as any Chinese citizen. The army were the most beloved of people, after all. I had invited friends to dinner at my home in Sydney on June 4th, not realizing that it would turn out to be a wake. All through that night, as we drank much and ate little, I tried hopelessly to call Beijing. Over and over I called the apartments of friends in the diplomatic compounds, hoping they would have news of friends who we knew had been in the square and who we had no way of contacting. The very first Chinese friend I had made was at my house that night. 3.5 years since he had taken me to his Hutong home to see his paintings, he was now a Sydney-sider. Given a chance to come to Australia earlier that year for an artist's exchange, he had chosen not to go back. His girlfriend, my friend, had been in the square every day. Now he sat pale and terribly still, watching me as I tried to every phone number I had. In the days that followed, we rode a roller coaster of hope and despair. Rumors circulated of dissension in the army, of some units facing off against others on the outskirts of Beijing. Rumors, too, that the government might fall. It would be 5 days before there was any sign of the leadership, and in those days, we dared to wonder. On June 5th, we had a moment that brought a kind of comfort, even joy, as we watched a young man stand in front of a row of tanks rolling down Chang'an Avenue. In his neat white shirt and dark pants, he seemed to stand in for all the Beijingers who had faced down the army for so long. In those days, I watched the footage from Beijing over and over again. In the flare of tracers across the sky, the soldiers with rifles cocked, stalking across the square silhouetted by fire, the goddess of democracy crumbling to the ground, the students leaving Tiananmen in the gray dawn light, flashing peace signs and hugging each other, and the terrible footage of the injured being rushed to hospital, the pedal carts that once might have carried spring strawberries speeding down the street laden with the dead and dying. As before, I found a line of poetry stuck in my head. This time it was Yeats and his famous poem, Easter 1916, about the Eastern Rising in Ireland against the British. He too had seen ordinary people transformed by events. All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. 2 months later, Shenqi caught the train back to Beijing. He had left the capital before the end of May, his parents' pleas finally too hard to resist. The news on television had told of a bloody riot in which soldiers had been lynched by an angry mob. People arriving home in Hefei from Beijing told a different tale, of citizens slaughtered on the streets. On the train were 2 obvious army types, but they were in mufti. Since Shenqi had been a kid, he had dreamed of being one of them. As a child, he even borrowed a uniform from a cousin who was a soldier and had himself photographed in it. He loved that photo, and now the soldiers were hiding their uniforms away. Once on the streets of Beijing, evidence of what had happened was all around him, in the bullet-scarred walls along Chang'an Avenue, and in the eyes of the heavily armed soldiers who still patrolled the streets. The soldiers had hatred in their eyes, but also fear. They were too frightened to go into a public toilet alone, Shenqi told me. One evening he was riding his bike east along Chang'an Avenue from Xidan and was stopped by soldiers and questioned. They treated me as if I was an enemy. I had dreamed of being one of them, and now they were pointing their guns at me. My dream collapsed. I started to become skeptical about everything. I started to question everything, mistrust everything. I think it was kind of a sickness. It was then, he told me, that I really understood Beidou's poem. I do not believe. Shenqi drifted through the days. Once he had felt part of a new generation. They were young and had believed they had a shining future. Now all seemed lost. He began an affair with a new girl. It turned out she had been wounded on June 4th. She showed him the scars. He had dreamed of being a soldier, a hero, an artist, but now it all seemed laughable. 5 years ago, when he had been accepted to college, he had run for joy. Now he felt heavy and old. He wished there was some way he could just cut himself free of the past, to cut time in two. One day he found himself listening to the radio in the apartment he was staying. Over the airwaves came the raucous banter of crosstalk, China's traditional form of comedy. 2 comedians were going at each other hammer and tongs, out punning each other in a rising cacophonic duel of sound. He started to laugh. He couldn't stop. Suddenly, he seemed to have soared high above himself. He looked down and watched the blood flow from his left hand. In the right, he held a knife. He felt released, like his soul had jumped free of his body. And his blood kept pouring from where, in his madness, he had cut his little finger clean away from his hand. Everywhere else in the world, the magic year of 1989 delivered on its promise. 200 years after the storming of the Bastille, revolution again swept Europe. The Berlin Wall fell, and the communist governments of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania were toppled. I watched with joy as the East Germans broke down the wall, and excitement as the Eastern Bloc crumbled. But I was also filled with sadness and anger. When the students first went to the square, I, like them, had not longed for the government to fall, but now I raged. How was it possible that all these other communist regimes could fall like ninepins, and China's, which had murdered its own people, hardly seemed disturbed? 20 years later, a Chinese friend confided that it was only by thinking, in 10 years, this gang of murderers will be swept away, that he had kept himself from going mad in those terrible weeks and months after June 4th. In those days, I tried to believe the same. 25 years later, I asked Guo Jian what was the most frightening thing he confronted that night of June 3rd. Was it facing all the dead in the hospital, or trying to rescue wounded from the street? He told me it was neither. What was the scariest, he said, was realizing that it could have been him riding into Beijing that day. I saw these young men in uniform, just like I had been, and I saw them shoot at unarmed people, and I thought, if I was still in the army, I would have been expected to do these things. I would have been sent here to kill. And you think, surely you would have resisted, but then you realize you probably would have followed orders, because that's what soldiers do. That's the thing that scares me the most. Looking at them in uniform, firing and maneuvering like I had been taught, I realized that up there on the truck was a young soldier, and he was me. And down in the street there was a student, and he was me too. On that day I was killing myself. Chapter 6. Nothing to my name. Early in a new decade, a 13-year-old boy named Jia Aili went exploring in his gritty northeastern town. He had discovered a marvelous new playground, factory halls where gigantic machines and intricate industrial equipment stood shrouded in dust, and not a living soul there to challenge him. On one unforgettable day, he made his way into a warehouse full of military aircraft, where half-built engines and disembodied wings waited for assembly crews that would never come. His town felt like a paradise to him, but it was an industrial graveyard. Jia Aili was born in Dandong in Liaoning province, a region once celebrated by Mao Zedong for its economic contribution as the eldest son of the nation. Liaoning had industrialized early. Rich in natural resources, it had been built up under Japanese occupation, and in the early decades of the People's Republic, it became the center of China's heavy manufacturing. Under the communist system of state ownership and central planning, Liaoning's factory had at one time supplied more than 70% of the nation's iron and 60% of its steel, and by the dawn of Deng Xiaoping's era of reform, 10% of China's medium and large state-owned enterprises were located in the province. These entities dominated life for the people of the region, supporting them from cradle to grave with work, housing, healthcare, retirement pensions, employment opportunities for their children, and even entertainment. Employees in the Northeast were the aristocracy of the workers' state, toiling for the grandest of the nation's central plans. But from the moment that China embraced Deng Xiaoping's new reform blueprint in 1978, the workers' influence waned. No longer was China focused on self-sufficiency and the nation's basic needs, but on a new vision where the country would be the factory of the world, catering to the appetite of the West for consumer goods. These would not be produced in the old industrial towns of the Northeast, but in the newly tooled factories of the rising South. By the end of the 90s, millions would be thrown out of work in Liaoning province, among them Jia Aili's parents. Many of them found themselves without adequate pensions or much prospect of finding meaningful work, reduced to watching powerlessly while enterprises they had once considered their own were bankrupt and their assets transferred into the hands of those with power or influence. a new aristocracy which the workers had little chance of joining. Tucked up in the region once known as Manchuria, bordering North Korea to the east and with Russia to the north and Mongolia to the west, the towns of Liaoning province could only dream of the opportunities opening up for China's southern coastal cities, whose close neighbors were the booming economies of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and whose ports looked towards Southeast Asia and beyond. It was there that Deng Xiaoping created the special economic zones, and it was there that rural workers flocked from the communes in search of a new life. Meanwhile, Jia Aili wandered in the shuttered factories where dust danced in the shafts of light that fell on disused turbines and forgotten flying machines. Years later, crashed planes and ruined machinery would appear again, like ghosts on the giant canvases that would make his name. 3,000 kilometers south of Jia Aili's home in the summer of 1992, 5 girls were involved in an intricate game in the garden. They jumped, they ran, they smiled, they stopped. Then they started all over again. The girls weren't really playing, though they were pretending. In fact, they were acting, and the older sister of one of them was directing. She had done something daring. After a year of studying in a hard-won place at university, she had dropped out to join China's infant advertising agency. Today she was shooting her first ad. It was for acne cream, and wasn't that enough to make any teen jump for joy? Her little sister was delighted, but not by the prospect of clear skin. For a few years now in her home in Guangzhou, she had been watching the advertisements broadcast from Hong Kong, 120 kilometers away. Now, she was learning how those ads were made, how to create, and how to fake. Her name was Cao Fei, and like Jia Aili, she was destined to be an artist. Cao Fei was born in 1978, and Jia Aili in 1979. They are both children of the era of reform and opening up. They have no direct memory of the time before Deng Xiaoping, no memory of Mao, no baggage from the Cultural Revolution. Their lives were shaped by the new revolution that started when they were born. And yet, they did feel the echoes of the earlier era. Cao Fei felt it in the way her parents embraced new opportunities with such hunger. Her mother had spent the Cultural Revolution restoring propaganda films frame by frame so they could be sent out on tours to educate the masses. Her father, a sculptor, had focused his talent on a single subject, Chairman Mao, so that the great helmsman could stand in yet another city square, at one more factory gate, in one more commune. Now Cao Fei's parents were restored to their original occupations as teachers, and they were also free to take work beyond the doors of the academy. Her father took commissions for portraits of a vast new cast of characters, local heroes, pre-revolutionary historical figures, even an influential foreigner with a curious name, Juan Antonio Samaran, who Cao Fei's father cast in bronze as part of China's campaign to win the favor of the International Olympic Committee. Cao Fei's mother, in her spare time, began to create delicate prints depicting a kind of private life that just a few years before had been derided and condemned. She rejoiced in works that had no revolutionary meaning at all, dwelling on imagined pleasures as simple as a woman playing with a cat. Meanwhile, both parents buried themselves in the avalanche of new reading that suddenly became available, books about artists like Rodin, Monet, and Picasso. For Jia Aili, the echoes of the past were more poignant. The new era made his parents redundant, and the grand economic plans for which they had toiled were gone. As Cao Fei's south boomed, Jia Aili's north was rusting away. As Cao Fei's parents saw new horizons opening up, Jia Aili's saw the things that gave their life meaning shuttered away in deserted factories. And yet, the new era brought Jia Aili an opportunity that no one in his family had ever had before. At the end of the decade, he would find himself at university, having sat the open exam that had been re-established by Deng Xiaoping in the early days of the reforms. Cao Fei and Jia Aili were destined to be part of an in-between generation, young enough to have escaped the dark experiences of the Cultural Revolution, but old enough not to take the shiny new China of today at face value. They would understand it had not been achieved without loss and pain. It is the subtlety of perception that marks these 30-somethings and makes them, as Cao Fei remarked to me one day, neither natural optimists nor pessimists. "We are always le guan, bei guan, always optimism and pessimism together," she said. More than any other generation, they represented the polarities of today's China, and even in their work they reflected the contrasting experiences of a single generation. As Jia Aili presented his melancholy vision of China in the time-honored materials of oil and canvas. Xiaofei creates her work on video and on the internet, sending out her avatars to explore alternative worlds. In the 1990s, when Xiaofei and Jia Aili entered their teens, was destined to be the most wrenching of the decades since 1978, the most rapid period of change that China had ever experienced. Millions of people's lives would be transformed for better or for worse. As a way of life passed away in the north, a new one would open up in the south. Fortunes would be made that would open up a gap between rich and poor that today yawns wider than ever. A middle class would begin to form, and a new unspoken contract would be made between rulers and the ruled. The terms were clear. We can make you richer than you've ever been, but political power must rest with the party alone. China's security today still rests on maintaining the stability of that grand bargain struck a quarter of a century ago. Xiaofei's hometown of Guangzhou was to play a leading role in the transformation of China. Today the city leads a southern Chinese economy based on the Pearl River Delta, which accounts for almost 40% of China's trade and 20% of its GDP. But during the 1980s, Guangzhou itself developed only slowly, as a matter of deliberate policy. In the 1980s, Zhao Ziyang had promoted the use of special economic zone as safe spaces in which China could experiment. In these zones, foreign investment, private enterprise, and the creation of new export-oriented industries could be pioneered without risking the positions of the traditional leaders of China's industrial economy. By the end of the 1980s, the experiment had already proved an extraordinary success, attracting substantial foreign investment and local entrepreneurship. The leading special economic zone was Shenzhen. It had been barely more than a fishing village in 1980, but when declared a special economic zone, it became a magnet for workers from around the country. Located just across the border from Hong Kong, Shenzhen became a kind of annex to the still British-administered territory. Hong Kong businesses relocated en masse to Shenzhen in the pursuit of cheaper land and labor, and the once ubiquitous Made in Hong Kong label would be overtaken by one reading Made in China. Shenzhen became known for its free-wheeling atmosphere, while its venerable older brother, Guangzhou, just 100 kilometers away, remained relatively staid and unmoved. Then in the early 1990s, Deng turned his attention to Guangzhou and to Shanghai, looking to these historically important port cities to help drag China out of the slump that had followed the events of 1989. It might have been thought that Deng's ruthless actions in 1989 would have enhanced his position as the dominant figure in Chinese politics, but in the months following the crackdown, he found himself instead on the defensive as his treasured economic reforms came under threat. Party hardliners who had long been suspicious of opening the economy and who hankered for the days of central planning argued that it was the speed and scope of Deng's reform that had provoked the Tiananmen protests. They argued for a slower pace of growth, increased central control, and stricter ideological purity. The toppling of Zhao Ziyang and the purge of reformist voices inside and outside the government left Deng all the more exposed, and a conservative low-growth strategy was accordingly endorsed. Arguments even began to be made that special economic zones should be abolished altogether. These were frightening years for the communist regimes. The toppling of the Eastern Bloc governments in 1989 was a grim warning of what might happen in China, and the resignation of Gorbachev in 1991, followed by the breakup of the Soviet Union, was deeply shocking. In the new decade, the world seemed to be tilting on its axis toward the capitalist West. But Deng believed there was more to fear from low growth than economic reform. Only rapid growth, he believed, would help China escape the drag of its huge population and underdevelopment. No doubt he saw that only by delivering a better life could the Communist Party's legitimacy be maintained. China had no choice but to ride the tiger. Finally, in January 1992, he fixed on a plan to use his personal influence and charisma to go over the heads of the leadership in Beijing to restart his reforms. He announced a Southern inspection tour, traveling to Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen in order to assess their development. The term Southern Inspection Tour, Nanxun, was chosen carefully. It was used by the great Qing Emperor Kanxi to describe his 6 expeditions to the southern reaches of his empire in the middle years of his reign, 1661 through 1722. With this echo of a lost era of Chinese glory, Deng was signaling the importance of his own journey. He aimed to draw attention to the success of Shenzhen and finally give his blessing to the long-dampened ambitions of Shanghai and Guangzhou to regain their historical positions as powerhouses of China. At first, the Chinese media ignored Deng's tour, reflecting the disapproval of the hardliners in Beijing, but before long, his travels and his comments were being widely reported. As he traveled, he reiterated his view that development required that some should be able to get rich first, and observed sharply that ideology cannot supply rice. Only reform and rapid development could save China from ruin, he declared. The low-growth policies being pursued in Beijing could only lead to stagnation. The province of Guangdong, home to Guangzhou and Shenzhen, should, he said, move rapidly to take up its place alongside the four little dragons of Asia: Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. In pursuing this goal, Deng directed, the achievements of Shenzhen could be taken as a model. Deng's blessing was a key moment for Shenzhen. The special economic zone was always a target for attack at times of the political upheaval. It had been singled out during the anti-spiritual pollution campaign in 1983, and its citizens had been denounced as gold diggers by hardliners in the government in the months after June 4th. Shenzhen's gratitude to Deng is still on show in the city today. A huge billboard celebrating his blessings of the city stands on a special dedicated square, depicting a disembodied, godlike Deng looming over a panorama of the city. Deng's endorsement of Guangdong province and later Shanghai in 1992 would prove pivotal. Guangdong's capital, Guangzhou, and the port of Shanghai were cities laden with symbolism. They were places that had been built by trade. To elevate them to the center of economic policy was to leave no doubt that reform and opening up were back in business. In the aftermath of June 4th, 1989, the south of China, and specifically Shenzhen, held a different kind of symbolism for those who had demonstrated in Beijing. Shenzhen equaled hope. If you could get there, then Hong Kong and the rest of the world were within your reach. In the days after June 4th, the arrests of students and others who had been active in Tiananmen Square proceeded rapidly, but for a few short days, local police in Beijing defied the roundup, issuing passes for travel to Shenzhen to any student who applied. I had never seen the police be like that. So good, Guo Jian reminisced years later. For a few days after June 4th, there was a long queue outside the local police station in the university quarter, and the police were going along the line saying, "Are you a student? Who's a student here? Come in, come in." And they were just handing out passes to all the students without question. On June 5th, Guo Jian secured his pass to Shenzhen, but he couldn't bring himself to use it. I kept saying to my foreign friends, I haven't done anything wrong. But they said, it doesn't matter, you need to go. Finally, he returned to the police station on June 8th for another pass, as his first had already expired. But the police were no longer welcoming students. They shooed us away really fiercely, but even in that, they were trying to protect us. They knew if we queued up, the soldiers would be able to pick us up easily. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, thousands of people were arrested, but there was a groundswell of support for the students that enabled many of those on the most wanted list to escape. Weir Kaishi and Chailing both took the underground railway to the west, via Guangdong, arriving in Hong Kong to be spirited immediately onto planes to France, and then later to the United States. Student leaders who did not manage to evade arrest were given prison sentences, but worker demonstrators were treated with particular harshness, with many being summarily executed. Numerous soldiers were court-martialed and, it was rumored, some were even executed for refusing to participate in the massacre on June 4th. Major General Xu Qingxian of the 38th Group Army was court-martialed and sentenced to 5 years in prison for his refusal to enforce martial law. Even today, at the age of 80, he is forbidden from visiting Beijing. Guo Jian found a way to drop out of sight in the capital, taking refuge first with a friend who had found shelter on a construction site near the university. A few weeks later, he moved out beyond the fringe of the city to the ruined grounds of the old summer palace. In the previous few years, a group of dropout poets had formed a community there, renting dilapidated accommodation from the local farmers who raised vegetables, pigs, and chickens on land where the Qing emperors had once taken their ease. The farmers were more than happy to take the money from the poets and, after Tiananmen, from young would-be artists too. This is how the old summer palace became the site of China's first artists' village, and within a couple of years, More than 200 aspiring artists were living there, including a roll call of future art millionaires of the next century. In the wake of the Tiananmen crackdown, many found themselves with demerits on their university records, unable to graduate, or assigned to the worst jobs. Guo Jian had been allowed to graduate because the professor who had talent spotted him years before had pleaded his case, but his job assignment was a punishment detail, designing teapots in a remote mountain factory. He turned it down and chose to hang out at the old summer palace, painting his own wry take on the china he saw around him, and selling the occasional painting to foreigners who came calling in search of what remained of the spirit of the 80s. For it wasn't just China that had suffered a shock in June 1989, but the West too. We had fallen a little in love with China in those spring days of 1989, and after the crushing of all that youthful hope, we kept on looking for clues to what remained and what might lie ahead. In the spring of 1993, a year after Deng Xiaoping had sent his signal that China was yet again open for business, a very different kind of message was sent out across the world. An exhibition, China's New Art, post-1989, opened in Hong Kong, and in a series of iterations went on to tour the world. It would give the West its first glimpse inside the hearts of the Tiananmen generation since June 4th. The curators were Li Xianting, one of the organizers of the China Avant-Garde exhibition in Beijing in February 1989, and Johnson Chang, a Hong Kong-born aesthete who founded the world's first gallery of Chinese contemporary art in Hong Kong in 1983. The two had been intimately involved in the burgeoning of Chinese contemporary art in the 1980s and were finally attuned to its new mood and direction. They saw early what would become obvious over the next decade, that contemporary art could provide a unique map of the emotional landscape of post-June 4th China. And with their new exhibition, they set out quite overtly to explore it. They recognized, too, that this was one of those rare moments in history when art captured the spirit of the times with work of extraordinary quality. This was a generation that had experienced the Cultural Revolution in childhood, had grown up to enjoy privilege of entry to university and the opening up of China to Western culture, had dreamed the wildest dreams during 1989, and experienced the most bitter disappointment, and would now confront the new materialism of a rising China. Surveying the scene as they prepared the exhibition, Li Xianting and Johnson Chang identified three major moods among the young artists, and in naming them, coined the vocabulary that would guide the discussion of Chinese contemporary art into the next century. The first movement they dubbed cynical realism. Its exponents used detached irony and satire to capture the psychological alienation of the times. One of the leading cynical realists was Fang Lijun, whose portraits of disaffected youth yawning wildly or blowing smoke straight into the face of the viewer would trigger multi-million-dollar bidding duels a decade later. Another was Yue Mingjun, known for his grinning, mirthless self-portraits. Secondly, they identified a form of iconoclasm they called political pop. This was a style of art that inserted communist icons, such as Chairman Mao and the three pillars of socialism, workers, peasants, and soldiers, into commercial imagery. Most pointed were the works of Wang Guangyi, whose massive triple portrait of Mao had caused such a stir at the China Avant-Garde Show in 1989. Now he created a series of paintings based on old Soviet-style woodcut posters in which square-jawed workers and heroic soldiers were the centerpiece of spoof advertisements for Coca-Cola and Montblanc. The last movement was the most subtle and the most poignant, and the curators called it the wounded romantic spirit. To represent the mood, they chose the work of a 35-year-old painter named Zhang Shaogang. The curators had been aware of Zhang Shaogang's work since the early 80s, and Li Xianting had included one of his paintings, a triptych called Forever Lasting Love, in the 1989 China Avant-Garde exhibition. That painting had a symbolist bent, blending religious and ethnic iconography from East and West in a surreal eclecticism which captured the experimental nature of the 1980s art scene. But as Johnson Chang prepared for the London opening of China's New Art post-1989, he received a letter from Zhang Shaogang, which brought news of work that was quite different. Looking at the photo that dropped out of the letter, Chang knew at once that he was looking at a real breakthrough. Feng Lijun had captured the cynicism of the age, and Wang Guangyi its materialism, but in his new work, Zhang Shaogang seemed to have captured its grieving soul. The painting was entitled simply Family Portrait. It depicted a man and a woman in drab workers' uniforms, the kind once worn across Chinese society, their faces shaded in half light. Between them sat their small son, his features a lurid pink, one eye turned shockingly inward. Wandering across the canvas was a thin, barely perceptible red line, like a cord that bound the group loosely together. Family Portrait, 1993, was the first in a series of works, 104 in all, that Deng Xiaoping would paint over the next decade, and which became known as the Bloodline series. All were portraits, mostly of 2 or 3 figures posed solemnly in the style of family photographs taken during the Cultural Revolution. A muted palette heightened the unsettling effect of the other elements. A translucent birthmark hovering over some of the faces, the overlarge jet-black eyes against soft-toned skin, the blank, haunted expressions, and the wayward red thread that joined the groups together. The images are full of ambiguity and dissonance, between reality and unreality, between peace and sadness, and between the conformity of the drab Maoist clothing and the individuality conferred by a turned eye or crooked teeth. Deng Xiaoping himself wrote that the figures in his paintings represent souls struggling one by one under the forces of public standardization, their faces bearing emotions smooth as water, but full of internal tension. To a Western eye, the portraits immediately conjured a sense of sadness, a glimpse into the heart of a traumatized nation. Johnson Chang told me years later that in the Bloodline imagery, he recognized a genuine breakthrough in the language of art. It was Western figuration that nonetheless felt Chinese. With this new language, Deng Xiaoping created works that speak equally as strongly to his own country as to the West. Indelibly associated with the time after Tiananmen, the Bloodline series reflects a period of loss which in a real sense has never ended. Today, Bloodline is one of the most recognizable series in Chinese contemporary art, and one of its most prized. In 2014, a work from the series, Bloodline, Big Family No. 3, sold at auction in Hong Kong for $12.1 million. Deng Xiaoping's childhood was marked by trauma. When young, he had been terrified by the behavior of his mother, who was only diagnosed as a schizophrenic after he had grown up. His father tried to keep the family of 4 boys together, but had little time for his youngest son. When Deng Xiaoping was just 8 years old, the Cultural Revolution broke out, and in the ensuing chaos, his mother's behavior came to seem almost normal for the first time in his life. In 1979, at the age of 21, he entered university, one of the many young people given the chance by the reopening of the universities to competitive examinations. Despite his father's resistance, he enrolled in art, and it was at the Sichuan Academy of Fine Arts in Chongqing that Deng Xiaoping first found a place where he felt at home. Not in the academy itself, which he found stultifying, but with friends he made and the private world of inspiration they created for themselves out of the works they made and the books and music pouring in from the West. When I was at university, he told me, it was very academic and conservative. I thought I needed to protect myself and my ideas from that, and I wanted to enhance my creativity and my feelings. So I inoculated myself against the conservatism with Western books and music. The music, the books, and the art we made built up an atmosphere in which we could grow. From the moment he arrived at the academy, he knew he wanted to be an artist, and he persisted against all the odds and in the face of parental disapproval. At times he lived a hand-to-mouth existence, but like all those who came of age in the 1980s, he would look back later on that time with nostalgia. Taking in his grand Beijing studio one day in 2014, he told me he still turned to Western music to create the atmosphere he needed to work. Inspiration still came from his first loves, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, and Pink Floyd. Looking around his studio together, we stopped for a while by a print hanging in a quiet corner, one of a group of small works he had created about the same time as Triptych, Forever Lasting Love in 1988. It was hard to equate the artist he had become with the person who had created these whimsical and romantic works in the 1980s. After 1989, after June 4th, everything changed, he told me. I just didn't want to paint romantic things. You couldn't, I asked. I didn't have that feeling anymore, he replied quietly. In the 1990s, Deng Xiaoping had the opportunity to leave China for the West, but he decided to stay. To stay or to go was the great decision for many people in that decade. After June 4th, Western countries threw open their doors to young and talented people from China. Many would follow the lead of artists of an earlier generation, like Huang Rui, Wang Keping, and Ma Desheng, and leave China, believing only abroad they would have the freedom to develop. Others, despite having ample chance to leave, would stay. Among the stayers were Feng Nijin, the original cynical realist, and Wang Guangyi, the pioneer of political pop. But for others after 1989, it proved impossible to settle down again. Among these was Shengqi. His mother came to find him in the hospital in Beijing. For 20 days after he severed his finger, Shengqi lay in a fever, an infection raging in his blood. He asked his mother not to cry when she saw what he had done, but she did so all the same. She took him home with her to Hefei to nurse him back to health. In the weeks that followed, he sought out a Tai Chi teacher, hoping to find peace and regain his strength. For 2 months he got up at 6 a.m. every day and practiced Tai Chi with the old man. It was a kind of meditation, I guess, he said. It was also a release. After 2 months he felt physically and mentally strong again. He also felt resolved. He could not stay in China. A friend in the Italian embassy helped him with a visa application, and by the spring of 1990, he was on his way to Rome. It would be a decade before he returned. In 1992, Gonkar Gyatso would also leave China, but he was not heading for the West. Instead, he would travel to India, to the seat of the Dalai Lama's government in exile, Dharamshala. When he returned to Lhasa from Beijing in 1984, he found his hometown transformed. It was full of colors, scents, and sight that were new to him. The new policy of religious tolerance had brought Buddhist practice back into the open, while members of Tibet's old society, who had been persecuted and imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution, members of the religious orders in the old aristocratic class, had been rehabilitated. With the monasteries reopened, he saw for the first time the true riches of Buddhist art. It was visually overwhelming, he told me. Every day he would meet with friends in one of the city's tea houses, spending hours debating how they could make art that was about the real Tibet. The change in the city was both exhilarating and confusing. I saw so many contradictory things that contradicted what we'd been taught before. We'd been educated since kindergarten that the landlords, the aristocrats, the monks, the Dalai Lama, they are all bad guys, bad elements. Then suddenly all those people are back, and they have become popular figures. Like, suddenly you can see the Dalai Lama's photo everywhere, and you can actually buy his photo on the streets. You can see the monks in their robes, and the aristocrats too, and the government is giving them back their land and their houses. It was just such a reversal. All the things he now saw around him made him wonder what Tibetan society was really like before 1959 when the Dalai Lama went into exile. I had this hunger to know more about my own history, but there was a kind of big blank. Nobody told us what things were really like before 1959. The government version was that before 1959, Tibet was a very dark and very cruel society. But then suddenly, when everything was opened up in the 80s and was aired, it seemed like all those dark things were actually positive. I realized there was no way to actually find out what was the real story and what was not. I had already realized when I went to Beijing that I was Tibetan, not Chinese. And so now I thought, so if I am Tibetan, what do I really know about my tradition? One day he came across some speeches by the Dalai Lama, which had been smuggled on cassette tapes into China. When I listened, I thought, if I can go and see him, maybe he can give me some guidance. In 1992, he flew out for Nepal. He'd waited almost 5 years for a passport and permission to leave. His father had relations in Nepal, and the Chinese authority finally granted Gonkar an exit visa for a family visit. In Nepal, his relatives advised him how to get to Dharamshala. He must discard his Chinese passport, they told him, and take a bus to the Indian border with a group of other Tibetans. There he should approach the border guards, and when challenged, he should just say, Dalai Lama, Dalai Lama, and that would get him into India. Gonkar threw away his hard-won passport and set off. At the border, it happened just the way his relations said it would. At the sound of the Dalai Lama's name, the guards waved him through. And so it was that, in search of his identity, Gonkar became a refugee. I returned to China in the autumn of 1993. I had begun working with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, the year before, on a new television program called Foreign Correspondent. Over the next few years, I would visit China numerous times to produce stories for the ABC, allowing me once again to track the changes in the country at first hand. I had mixed feelings about coming back. I longed to be in the country again, but I also feared what I would find. I had received ample reports of the gloom that had settled over China in the months after June 4th, 1989, the imposition of a new program of ideological purification, and of the many arrests. The sentences handed out, particularly to the workers who had been caught up in the demonstrations, were chilling. There was also news of the bulldozing of many of the old Beijing neighborhoods, as if the city itself was being punished. These were the years when the bonds of collective ownership of real estate started to dissolve. It was the beginning of a gigantic transfer of wealth that was to create China's first generation of millionaires. Old residents were moved to high-rise housing on the outskirts of the city, while hutongs where Beijingers had lived for hundreds of years were flattened for new developments. The fabric of Beijing would be altered beyond recognition during this decade, and it would only be in the 2000s that a movement supporting historical preservation would be heard. Meanwhile, a steady stream of friends who had been active in the bohemian or intellectual circles in China were arriving to take up self-imposed exile in Australia. They told of a stultifying atmosphere of harassment by the police, of a sense of hopelessness. And yet, there were signs of life. The exhibition, China's New Art Post-1989, had arrived in Sydney in June 1993. There were exciting films coming out of China too, like Farewell My Concubine, which took out the Palme d'Or at Cannes that May, a film which hid its political critique inside its sweeping historical narrative. Word came too of a new strain of hooligan literature and a dropout culture that spoke of a kind of passive resistance among the young. By 1991, foreign money was again pouring into China. I was intrigued by the strategy behind Deng's Southern Inspection Tour, especially his vision for Shanghai. In the 1980s, I had got used to hearing of the Chinese government's determination to keep Shanghai down. The city had been deliberately bypassed when decisions were being made about where the Chinese economy would be opened up, and for a decade, as the special economic zones in Guangdong province boomed, Shanghai had labored under the weight of out-of-date state-run enterprises and central planning. Suspicion of Shanghai ran deep. Its modern history was deeply entwined with the story of Western exploitation of China. At the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842, Britain forced a series of commercial concessions on China, including the designation of Shanghai as a free trade port. Standing at the mouth of the Yangtze, Shanghai was the ideal gateway to the rich hinterland of China's south and an excellent platform for industrial development. By the early 20th century, Shanghai had become the most important financial center in Asia and one of the great industrial trading cities of the world. But trade and industry were just part of the story. Shanghai was one of those cities, like Paris or New York, whose name you could conjure with. Shanghai spoke of glamour, opium, cheongsams, and chemin de fer, of jade, silk, and easy money. By the 1920s, it had been crowned in popular imagination as the Paris of the East. The city became a magnet for gamblers, nightclub singers, white Russians, writers, and people looking to create new life. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in a suite at the Peace Hotel, and Margaret Fontaine studied ballet in the city with exiled Russian masters. The French concession had gracious avenues planted with plane trees, while the British enjoyed tennis and the long bar at their gentlemen's club. Along the waterfront, known as the Bund, foreign banks, trading companies, and foreign hotels raised grand granite edifices in the Western style, marbled floor and colonnaded, guarded by stone lions of stern British mien. Shanghai was a place where fortunes were made and made quickly, and not just by Westerners. Shanghainese became famous for their business acumen. While the communists took over in 1949, many migrated to Hong Kong, where they rose quickly to prominence as the leading business people of the colony. It can be argued that much of Hong Kong's business success today was built on the back of displaced Shanghainese entrepreneurs. Deng Xiaoping's decision to give Shanghai its head in the 1990s was thus a calculated one. He knew what visions the name Shanghai conjured for foreigners. What better place to declare as open for business than a city that the West already felt they had a stake in? What better way to lure the foreign investment the country so desperately needed than by offering entry to this fabled city? As for me and the new ABC China correspondent Sally Neighbor, we were hooked. Discussing what to do for our first story together for Foreign Correspondent, we couldn't get past Shanghai. An investigation of what was happening in the city basically chose itself. In September 1993, we were there. Everyone told us to stay in the newly opened Hilton, but we chose the Peace Hotel instead. With its dim lighting, musty, muddy-colored carpets, and solemn staff, it had come down a long way from its original Art Deco splendor. But this was where Noel Coward had stayed, and the gray-haired jazz band that played the lobby bar every evening was said to have first performed there before the communists came. Best of all, the Peace Hotel stood on the dress circle of the Bund, looking out over the Huangpu River that connects the Yangtze to the sea. As the sun came up palely in the polluted sky on our first morning in the city, we watched a fleet of barges make their way upriver. They were laden with sand and cement, heading for the scores of construction sites around the city. We were there at the dawn of the building boom which, over the next few years, would create a whole new infrastructure of ring roads, subway lines, and a grand bridge across the river to a vast new development zone called Pudong. Pudong was an ambitious project to be built on 350 square kilometers of rural land that had supported more than 500,000 farming households. It was planned as a financial and commercial center that the leadership hoped would one day rival Hong Kong. On that autumn morning, Pudong presented a strange sight. At its center was the already completed Oriental Pearl TV tower, decked with roseate orbs that gave the whole structure a kind of cartoonish feel, as if the design had been taken from the Jetsons. Around the tower, high-rise apartments, office blocks, and factories were already taking shape, while farmers hung on the emerald patches of rice paddy between the construction sites. As we looked out across the river at the future, the granite edifices of old Shanghai stood at our backs, while the sounds of a port city, the sad moan of the ship's horns, the cries from the bargemen, the hum of the engines, were mixed with the sound of a Strauss waltzing issuing tinly from a ghetto blaster. All around us on the elevated walkway by the river, there were Chinese couples dancing. They came here, we discovered, at dawn every day to practice their steps, waltzes and sambas, foxtrots and the cha-chas, with a proficiency most Westerners could only dream of. Young, middle-aged, and old couples gathered each morning, wearing natty tailored outfits and sharp shoes, two-toned lace-ups for the men, and black leather court shoes for the women, all slightly worn, but otherwise well cared for. You could sense they, too, had held on to the idea of Shanghai they wanted to live up to. Over the next days, we put together the pieces of our story. During business hours, we followed the agenda laid down by the city's Foreign Affairs Bureau, who assigned us 2 minders to dog our every step. After dark, we pursued the encounters that would bring the story to life. The construction workers from the countryside now laboring through the night on the new city buildings, the young entrepreneur who had escaped to the west after June 4th, but had now returned to sell natural mud packs to the newly beauty-conscious Shanghainese, the investors in the recently established stock market swiping tips and forming syndicates, and the farmers in Pudong chasing one last harvest before the bulldozers moved in. Huge swaths of old Shanghai were being razed for new developments, and the residents were being rehoused across the river in Pudong. In those days, few people wanted to move to the new accommodation. We visited an informal housing exchange where a broker sorted out people's living arrangements for a fee. He would find a person willing to trade down to less space to stay in old Shanghai and put them together with someone who was happy to cross the river for a modern bathroom. It had once been the case that you had to live where you were put, in accommodation linked to your work unit, but the old rules were gone, and ordinary people were making new ones to suit themselves. The housing broker disavowed any financial motive for setting up the exchange. He kept trying to tell us he had established it out of a simple desire to serve the people, in the words of the old Maoist slogan. If anyone wanted to give him a gift of money out of appreciation, he said that was just a happy bonus. Deng Xiaoping may have given his blessing to the idea of getting rich, but many people still thought it safer to keep one's foot in the orthodox past while they dipped a toe in the future. Down at the stock exchange, people were happier to admit it was all about the money. The exchange had opened in 1990, trading shares in what were still majority state-owned enterprises. Issuing small parcels of shares became a favored way for these enterprises to raise funds, bringing in investment without surrendering control. In those days, a number of small exchanges had opened around Shanghai, making it as convenient to buy stocks as to go to a betting shop in the West. The one we visited was housed in what had once been a Russian Orthodox church, but only we seemed to think this was funny. There we met a number of ordinary traders who admitted to doing well. Many were investing what were quite large sums in the Chinese context, and some spoke of their intention to put a third to a half of their savings into the exchange. Like small investors the world over, they seemed to have little sense that the stock market might ever go down. A number of them also claimed to be working for others as well as themselves. One told us he invested on behalf of a whole syndicate of taxi drivers, having got into conversation with one of them on a ride home from the exchange. He claimed to take only a percentage when the stocks went up, and not a cent if things did not pan out. He told us he had hundreds of thousands of renminbi, RMB under management, this at a time when the annual per capita GDP ran only around 3,000 RMB. Although I was a little skeptical, I was reminded of the taxi driver syndicate years later when the Chinese billionaire and former Shanghai taxi driver Liu Yichen rose to prominence as an art collector. With his wife Wang Wei, he has now built 2 sprawling private museums in Shanghai to house his collection of Chinese and Western art. Soon, one of the star attractions would be the Modigliani nude that he picked up in November 2015 for $170.4 million, at the time of the writing the second highest price ever paid for a work of art at auction. As we made our way around the city, it was hard to escape the sense of excitement that Shanghai was finally on the move again. Officially, some 150,000 workers had flocked into the city to work on construction sites in 1993 alone, but unofficially, the number of so-called migrant workers fueling the building boom was believed to be much greater. The workers came from rural provinces like Anhui, where the dissolution of the communes was creating a vast surplus of workforce. The work they did in Shanghai was backbreaking, with long shifts keeping construction going day and night, but the workers still felt they were stepping up in the world. One told us that if he had stayed at home, he would simply have been a coolie. Now he had his own money to spend and places to go and have fun. Moving to Shanghai had given him a kind of autonomy that not long before would have been impossible. Shanghai is a good place full of money, he told us, but then added with a laugh, it's easy to make and easy to lose. We wondered whether the government would be able to control resurgent Shanghai, failing to notice what would become more obvious later, that much of the development in the city was being driven by the state itself, not private entrepreneurs. For all the talk, Shanghai was not going to become another Hong Kong or even another Shenzhen. The ideas that had underpinned the economic reforms in the 1980s, that the productive forces in the country should be liberated through incentives to individual enterprise, were being downplayed post-1989 in favor of a new kind of state capitalism. In Shanghai, foreign investment would be directed solely into state-owned enterprises, while Chinese banks would be encouraged to favor the state-owned sector also, leaving private entrepreneurs to raise money in a new, unregulated and risky shadow banking sector. The Shanghai we saw was on its way to being a leader again, but in a very different manner to its pre-communist past. The city was in the vanguard of a new approach to development that would end up defining the whole Chinese economy by the end of the 1990s. Shanghai would demonstrate how powerful the state could be in creating profits for itself when it exploited its monopolies, in particular over the ownership of land. Land grabs by the state, like those that occurred in Pudong, where traditional users of the land would be evicted with minimal compensation only to see the land use rights resold at a massive profit, are now commonplace across China. Profits are turned towards new developments, infrastructure and services, but also towards creating wealth for a well-connected few. Shanghai in the 1990s was where China's crony capitalism of today was born. On our last evening in Shanghai, Sally and I decided to toast the city from the top of the Peace Hotel, with its stunning view across the river. In theory, the roof was out of bounds, but we ordered gin and tonics in the lobby bar and smuggled them into the lift to the top floor. We found a stairway to the roof and stood looking out, giggling like schoolgirls. Inevitably, a hotel worker appeared and made a half-hearted attempt to chase us down into the hotel again. He gave us a short lecture about safety, but you could tell he, too, was seduced by the view from the roof. As he withdrew, he tutted with disapproval as he saw us leaning back against the dusty masonry. A couple of minutes later he returned, not to order us off the roof, but with collapsible chairs for us to sit on. The old spirit of the Peace Hotel clearly lived on in his heart. Viewed from our eyrie, the Pudong side of Shanghai was mostly dark, nothing like the neon-lit landscape that it is today, but the reflection of the ungainly pink spire of the Pearl TV Tower shimmered in the river. We recalled that the view from the tower was one of only two things our Chinese minders in Shanghai had been truly excited about showing us. The other was a very special restaurant that they had been angling to take us to from our first hour together. Day after day we had blocked the suggestion. We had too much ground to cover to spare time for an interminable introduction to Shanghai's local delicacies. Finally, on the last day, we relented. It said more about the new Shanghai than anything else we saw that week, that the very special restaurant turned out to be the first ever Chinese outlet of the fast food giant KFC. By the time we arrived to shoot our story in Shanghai in 1993, around 70 million people throughout the country had joined what would become known as the floating population, people who had been cut free by the dissolution of the communes. These workers would power the transformation of China over the next decade, building the skyscrapers and the roads, the subways and the bridges, operating the machinery and manning the assembly lines that would turn China into the factory of the world. The displacement that had begun in the 1980s would accelerate through the 1990s at a stunning rate. By 1999, the China that had begun the great experiment in reform and opening up 21 years before would be almost unrecognizable. The generation of which Zhao Aili and Chao Fei were a part would come of age at the end of the 20th century, having already experienced more change than most of us in the West would know in a lifetime. Zhao Aili would witness the decline of the monolithic state enterprises, the cradle-to-grave socialism that had once guided the nation. He would see his parents made redundant while still barely middle-aged, but also find himself being given the chance to enter university, the first in his family to have ever done so. Cao Fei would watch as her hometown of Guangzhou spread out into the Pearl Delta River, engulfing farmland and absorbing villages as it rose from smoggy backwater to a powerhouse of the Chinese economy. She would see her older sister morph from a model student to advertising executive, turning her back on the most treasured ambitions of her parents. As for herself, Chao Fei would begin to dream and make art in a different world entirely, one that could be lived in costume, online, and eventually in a new virtual space called Second Life, where there were no boundaries of age, geography, or imagination. The speed of change in this decade would rival anything before or since. At the end of it, nothing in China would look the same, not even the farthest reaches of the country. At the end of the century, a whole new reality had taken hold, where a divide between rich and poor had been installed as pillars of progress, where the idea of the state providing you with work, security, and purpose had been consigned to the scrap heap, and where neighborhoods that had existed for centuries were wiped off the map overnight. Each year of the 1990s, I would return to China, and every year I would experience the shock of non-recognition, of arriving at a place I had once known well, only to find it simply wasn't there anymore. For me, it was sad, disturbing, even shocking. So what must it have been like for people who did not have another home to return to? One day, Deng Xiaoping and I sat in his studio discussing some of his new works, sculptures of ordinary but obsolete objects, transistor radios, rotary dial phones, ink bottles, music cassettes, all rendered in bronze. He told me he had, not for the first time, lately been struck with nostalgia. He felt that was okay for a man in his 50s like him, but then he said how strange it was to look at the work of artists who were only half his age and recognize nostalgia in their works too. He saw they were also making works recording the objects and scenes of their youth and rendering them with romantic poignancy. He realized that for them, the things and places that in their 20s they should be confident would remain with them were already slipping away. To be Chinese in this era, he told me, is to feel nostalgic when you are still quite young. Chapter 7. Whose Utopia? On February 19, 1997, Deng Xiaoping died. He was 92 and had not been seen in public for more than 2 years. The last glimpse was an official photograph from October 1994. He was seated in an armchair, tucked up in a rug and wearing a cap against the autumn chill, watching the fireworks for the 45th anniversary of the People's Republic exploding in the sky over Beijing. His passing had long been anticipated. Early in 1995, when I was working for Foreign Correspondent, Sally Neighbor and I had jumped the gun by 2 years, flying to China to produce what we intended as an obituary piece on the great man, who was rumored to be at death's door. We talked to a whole cast of characters on that trip in 1995, and learn how varied the experience of Deng's reform had been for the people, depending on where they lived, what they stood to lose or gain, or what vision of the future they nurtured. There was a newly made millionaire, a high school dropout who had made his fortune in real estate while still in his early 20s and was eager to share with us his taste for high-priced scotch and luxury cars. He drove us around Tiananmen Square and up the Avenue of Eternal Peace under the eyes of Mao's portrait without a hint of embarrassment. He told us he made a fortune transforming deserted factory buildings into smart office accommodation and was now developing apartments for the new middle class. Then there was a young pollster, at just 29, the head of his own company. Formerly a bureaucrat with the Ministry of Commerce, he had met an American executive from Gallup and thought there might be scope for a polling firm in China. He was right. One of his first customers was the Communist Party's propaganda department. His company was in the middle of a major survey of the floating population in Beijing, trying to understand more about the hundreds of thousands of former rural workers who had come from all around China to find employment in the capital. He described how they had congregated on the outskirts of the city, forming themselves into separate villages depending on where they came from. There was the Henan province village, which specialized in rag picking, and the Zhejiang province village that was full of entrepreneurs running small businesses. And then there were the workers from Anhui, who labored on construction sites and as domestic help. All of them had come to Beijing without permission, living on the margins with dreams of making a new life. We interviewed dissident intellectuals who placed hope in the development of a civil society in China as an alternative path to democracy. They pointed to the nascent environmental movement and to the non-government organizations which were beginning to appear, specializing in workers' rights or education for the poor. They took heart also from the rise of a more freewheeling and commercially minded media, with a new focus on personal pleasures like fashion and sport. The media kept clear of sensitive political ground, but there was a big market for crime news, and our informants explained how this allowed all sorts of titillating topics to be explored under the banner of law and order. Others we spoke to were less sanguine, such as a sociologist with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who had been studying the reforms since the 1980s. He warned of the fissures opening up in a society as the new economy eroded the secure guarantees of socialism and made workers more vulnerable. He believed workers and others should be able to form their own organizations, but knew the party wouldn't allow it. And yet it was heartening that he could at least float the idea, as he had in an article with the provocative title, "How much reform can Chinese society bear?" But we remember the sociologist's pessimism when we met with a young woman whose husband, a lawyer and an activist for workers' rights, was serving 3 years hard labor for the crime of printing T-shirts bearing the slogan, "Labor solidarity is sacred." She had been barred from seeing her husband for almost a year and had herself been detained for 3 months without charge. Even her attempts to send him mooncakes at the Mid-Autumn Festival had been denied. She seemed broken by this lack of basic decency and was angry that a slogan once embraced by the Communist Party was now seen as criminally subversive. It was clear that China was a richer and more powerful country for Deng's reforms, and in the private realm it was freer as well. But it was also true that a lack of political reform had allowed corruption to thrive and left ordinary people vulnerable. The government's harsh tactics, with even mild dissent, were disturbing too, and there had been no attempt at a reckoning with the tragedy of June 4th, 1989, something that would taint Deng's legacy in years to come. The contrast between the anguished woman whose husband was lost to the prison system and the brash young real estate millionaire was so stark that it was hard to believe they shared the same generation and the same city. The experience of economic reform for ordinary citizens was a profound shock, devastating for some and transformational for others. Take the example of the signature reform of the 1990s, the corporatization of hundreds of China's lumbering state-owned enterprises, SOEs. The shockwaves spread into all corners of Chinese society, bringing some regions to their knees and galvanizing others, destroying the hopes and plans of millions and making a handful into millionaires. Deng Xiaoping probably never said, "To get rich is glorious," despite the classic 1990s slogan being widely attributed to him. But he certainly did say that in the pursuit of development, it was necessary to let some people get rich first. By the end of the 1990s, it was clear who those people would be. Those with connections made a killing from the SOE reforms. They got in on the ground floor, working the angles in the sale of enterprise assets, or picking up shares in new commercial subsidiaries in advance of their listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Billions of dollars of state assets were transferred into such subsidiaries, effectively moving them from state to private ownership. Those with the best connections of all, members of China's elite families whose patriarchs had served as Mao's comrades in arms, a group popularly known as the Princelings, secured executive positions in the most promising of the newly corporatized enterprises, ones that commanded powerful stakes in key sectors like energy, communications, or banking. The SOEs had once been the backbone of the economy and the guarantors of the iron rice bowl that protected Chinese worker from cradle to grave. Their new mission would be starker: to maintain state control of strategic sectors of the economy while cutting loose the loss-making enterprises. Over 6 years from 1995 to 2001, the number of SOEs would be slashed by more than half, and some 36 million jobs would disappear. Shenyang was ground zero for the economic reforms which decimated the once proud industrial Northeast. The capital of Liaoning province, Shenyang witnessed the long, sad death of the old system, which had offered lifelong protection to workers. In the late 1990s, Shenyang and the whole province of Liaoning was racked by unrest as pensioners and unpaid workers took their grievances to the streets. At that time, it was estimated that more than a quarter of retirees' pensions were in arrears in Shenyang, while 23% of the city's workers were owed wages. Roads were blocked and government offices besieged. There were reports of riots and looting. But even as protests multiplied, those involved were careful to avoid any impression of being involved in an organized movement. They were diligent in presenting the official petitions to the government for redress, focusing narrowly on their particular grievances and disavowing any wider demands. They described their protests as spontaneous and avoided making common cause with people from other workplaces. The memory of what had happened to those who had tried to form independent workers' unions in 1989 was still fresh. Yet, anger ran hot over the corruption that was being exposed as the economy was transformed. As enterprises went bankrupt, workers sometimes caught a glimpse of how their assets had been stripped and diverted into private hands. In the provincial town of Liaoyang, some 85 kilometers from Shenyang, the workers' anger finally bubbled up into mass protests early in the new century. The trouble began with workers at the Liaoyang ferroalloy factory, or Liaoti for short. The workers at Liaoti had been petitioning the local government for help since 1998. Their wages and pensions were months in arrears, and it was an open secret that management were illicitly transferring the assets of the enterprises for private gain. In May 2000, after 2 years of petitioning without response, 1,000 Liaoti workers blockaded the Liaoyang-Shenyang highway in a desperate attempt to get the authorities to act and ensure their outstanding wages and pensions would be paid. Police broke up the protest, and even when the workers took their grievances directly to the city hall, they still got no response. The final straw came at the end of 2001, when Liaoti was declared bankrupt. All around them in the city, Liaoti workers saw other examples of bankrupted enterprises and workers like them being left without hope of recovering their back pay or retirees their pensions. In March 2002, they took their action to the streets once more, with 30,000 workers rallying in front of the local government headquarters, the biggest demonstration in China since 1989. The workers sang "The International" and protested the local government's lack of support for the workers and their complicity in the corruption. In an open letter, they called for the payment of owed wages and pensions and the removal of corrupt officials. A week later, the protests had spread far beyond Liaoti, and an estimated 100,000 workers rallied in the city. By the time of that demonstration, the authorities had already begun to round up the leaders of the movement. 2 were charged with subversion. In January of the following year, they were sentenced to 4 years and 7 years in prison. Even when sentenced, they remain unbowed, one declaring that he had no regrets and considered his 7-year sentence as a 7-year contribution towards democracy. There was some satisfaction when soon afterwards the manager of Liaoti was put on trial for corruption and drew a 13-year sentence. During these years of upheaval, Jia Aili had come to study in Shenyang. The Luxin Academy of Fine Arts was poignantly situated just next door to the once monumental industrial district of Tieshi. When Deng Xiaoping's reform began, Tieshi was the country's leading industrial center and home to 1 million workers, Now Jia Ali watched as it hollowed out and became an industrial wasteland. Eventually, even the emptied factory buildings disappeared. Raised to create commercial real estate, the factories were reduced to scrap, and a way of life passed away before his eyes. Of course, he had been witness to this demise in his hometown of Dandong since he was a boy. The concepts of reform and opening up are two separate things for us people in the Northeast, he told me one day. We experienced the reform, but not opening up. The 1990s was a very sad period, a very harsh period for us. 8 years after he arrived in Shenyang, Jia Ali would leave for Beijing, and it would be there that he staged his first exhibition. It would be titled The Wasteland. For all the wrenching social impact of the SOE reforms, few at the time realized that corporatization had a far-reaching upside as well. As SOEs shed their labor force, they were directed to give up the stock of housing they had maintained for their workers. In the late 1990s, huge swaths of urban housing in China were privatized, and the apartments sold to sitting tenants at prices well below market rates. In this way, tens of millions of Chinese were given the chance to acquire property that appreciated in value over the next few years. Many leveraged their asset for more real estate, becoming landlords or even speculators, and changing the outlook for their children. The result was a massive broadening of China's propertied middle class, their expectation and interests very different to the workers they had once been. It was as if, in the words of the economist and former Australian ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, Margaret Thatcher had come to China. In the year 2000, Xiaofei wrote her first email. It was her first encounter with the internet, a medium that as an artist she would soon make her own. To get her message into cyberspace, she had to ask around among her friends till she found one whose parents had an email account. It was on their computer that she wrote her first artist's statement. She had been asked by a curator to explain the ideas behind her first film, titled Imbalance. She made it the year before on a borrowed DVD recorder, casting her classmates at the Guangzhou Academy of Fine Arts into a study of restless adolescence. Entered in a competition in Hong Kong, it had caught the attention of curator Hu Hanru, who chose it for a photography festival in Madrid. Hu had been attracted by Xiaofei's filmmaking flair, the skew with camera angles and tracking shots. But what struck me when I saw Imbalance years later was how free her classmates seemed to be. Despite their adolescent angst, how mockingly they faced the world. The whole thing read like an advertisement for the pleasure of spiritual pollution. All the things that had agitated the old guard back in 1983, all the toxins they had sought to expel from China, pornography, drugs, gambling, were there, and not even as a main point of the film, but just as part of the background of these college kids' lives. They were enjoying the luxury of adolescence, an indulgence that was still new to China, in a city that was booming and open to the world. Guangzhou was the capital of Guangdong province, which by the year 2000 was producing 42% of China's exports and attracting the majority of the country's foreign investment. Workers flocked to the factories of the Pearl River Delta, and by the turn of the century, Guangdong province was home to a third of the 144 million workers who had by then left their villages in search of a new life. The South was being transformed socially and physically, and this was the subject of Xiaofei's next project. Through the 1990s, she watched as her hometown of Guangzhou grew, rolling out into the countryside, turning fields into factories, farms into condos. As Guangzhou grew, it began to swallow entire villages whole. The farmers would lose their fields but keep their houses. Robbed of their old livelihood, they built tenements on top of their homes and set up as landlords, offering cheap accommodation to the floating population of workers who had left other farms around China in order to find work in the city. Villages that had once been home to 3,000 or 4,000 people now housed 10 times that number in these strange pockets within the city. Slipping down an alley off a main street, you could find 130 such urban villages in Guangzhou, where the tenements crowded in so tightly that sun reached the ground only in shafts, and the old village life continued side by side with a whole new service economy for immigrants. Long-distance phone offices sat side by side with nail bars, dumpling shops, and workshops that restored discarded white goods for sale. The landless farmer planted vegetable crops and raised chickens on their roofs. On feast days, traditional dragon dancers squeezed their way through the narrow alleyways. One of these villages, A place called Sanyuanli became the subject of Chao Fei's first documentary film, produced in association with her then-boyfriend, the artist and writer Ning, in 2003. Like Jia Aili, Chao Fei saw the face of her hometown transformed as she grew up, but while Jia Aili became obsessed by wastelands, Chao Fei was gripped by cities. In the new century, she would return to urban landscapes again and again, creating whole fantasy cities on video, in animation and on the internet, while taking her camera out to explore real cities in her documentaries. In all of these, she was working out how people live in these urban spaces, and while living there, how they could still find a way to dream. By the turn of the century, with more than 10% of China's population on the move, many itinerants found appalling conditions in their new employment. Exploitation was rife in the factories, and much of the alternative urban work was dirty or dangerous. And yet, those who came still believed they had made the right decision by leaving home. In the factories of Guangdong, despite booming profits, non-payment and underpayment of wages was rife, as were inhumane hours of work. At the turn of the century, research by the Communist Party Youth League found the majority of factory workers in Guangdong worked 12 to 14 hours per day with rarely a day off. Conditions were particularly severe in the garment industry, where pressures to fill orders pushed conditions to new extremes. A new word, 过劳死, overwork death, entered the language to describe cases where workers dropped dead of exhaustion. The Chinese press reported 12 or more cases per year of 过劳死 in the early years of this century, while deaths due to industrial accidents were reported as occurring at a rate of 1 every 4 days in Shenzhen during 1998. Incidents of serious injury were also common, with Amnesty International counting more than 12,000 such incidents in that same year in Shenzhen. The special economic zone of Shenzhen was in the vanguard of China's transformation into a manufacturing superpower, its GDP growing by more than 30% a year on average throughout the 80s and 90s. In the 90s, Shenzhen would also become a pioneer in the labor activism, as workers there tried to enforce the rights that were laid down for them in China's national labor legislation. These laws, which prescribed conditions such as maximum hours and minimum pay rates, were routinely ignored by employers, but in the 90s there was an increasing number of cases where workers would, often Kafkaesque maneuvering through the system, achieve some limited redress. Some industrial actions began in almost comical circumstances, as happened in the case of an export textile factory recounted by the sociologist Qin Huangli in her brilliant study of labor activism in China against the law. In this instance, the workers were made aware of their rights when their boss set out to drill them on the correct answers to give to a visiting inspection team from the factory's American customers. This was how they learnt of their entitlement to 5-day work weeks, 8-hour days, Sundays off, and limits on overtime, all entirely absent within their workplace. China's labor law was enacted in 1994, but, like many other laws passed in the country since the beginning of reform, lofty ideals were not matched with the means, or often the will, to enforce them. Workers' frustrations over the inability to get what was legally theirs made Shenzhen infamous throughout the country as the worst city in China for labor disputes. By the turn of the century, even conservative estimates suggested that there were hundreds of large-scale protests or strikes breaking out annually in Shenzhen. Yet, despite the harshness of life in the cities, workers continued to leave the countryside in droves to try their luck. It is the dreams of these workers that have driven the urbanization of China, turning a country where 70% of people once lived on the land to one where more than half live in cities. The notion of success in the city persisted because, for the most part of those who came, despite all the difficulties they faced, they did end up better off. Most earned more than they would ever have been able to make at home. This was money that could be remitted to their families or used to fund vocational study or investment in a small business. Then there was the intangible but exhilarating gain that they made, a sense of control over their own destiny. Chao Fei's father recruited many of these rural itinerants to work with him on the massive sculptures which he was now being commissioned to create. Chao Fei spent hours hanging out with them, listening to their stories of their floating lives. The workers told her how they would fake their identity cards, lowering their age over and over again, as the young always found it easiest to find work. She was fascinated by their stories and curious about their dreams, which she put at the center of her art when she made the documentary, Whose Utopia? She spent 6 months in a Guangdong lighting factory, charting both the minutiae of the work and the fantasy lives of the employees. In whose utopia, the workers pirouette in tutus among the machines, play electric guitar, sweep through storerooms in evening dress, and dance like Gene Kelly across the shop floor. Young workers look out dreamily over the rooftops of the city and don t-shirts with the slogan, "My future is not a dream."